Don't eat the steak. It's poisoned. We need to get out of here quietly.
The smell hit first. Not the garlic. Not the slow braised veal that had been reducing in the kitchen since 4 in the morning. Not the rosemary oil that the head chef drizzled over everything like holy water. No, it was the other smell. The one underneath. Cold stone and old money and the particular stillness that settles into a room when a certain kind of man enters it. The kind of stillness that is not peace, but preparation. The kind that makes the air itself hold its breath. Ristorante Ferro occupied the ground floor of a converted textile warehouse on the east side of the waterfront district, a stretch of cobblestone and repurposed industry that had been reborn in the last decade as the city's most exclusive dining corridor. The building still carried the bones of its former life. Exposed steel beams ran across the ceiling like the ribs of some great slumbering animal. The walls were raw brick, darkened by a century of smoke and weather, and the lighting was kept deliberately low, amber-toned sconces casting pools of warmth that left the corners in shadow. The tables were heavy oak, hand-planed, set with linen so white it seemed to glow against the darkness. Crystal stemware caught the candlelight and scattered it in tiny fractured rainbows across the tablecloths. The floor was polished concrete, the color of wet slate, and every footstep echoed with a muted authority that made even the busboys walk like they were crossing a cathedral. It was the kind of restaurant where reservations were made 3 months in advance, where the wine list was a leather-bound volume thicker than most novels, and where the waitstaff moved with the silent choreography of a ballet company performing to an audience that never applauded. It was also the kind of restaurant where, every Thursday evening at precisely 8:45, the back dining room was closed to the public. The security cameras in that section experienced a scheduled maintenance blackout, and a party of 6 to 8 men arrived through a service entrance that opened onto a private alley accessible only from a gated courtyard. Elena Vasile had worked at Ristorante Ferro for 11 months. She had applied with a resume that listed 3 years of experience at a mid-range bistro upstate, a food safety certification, and a reference from a manager who, if anyone had called to verify, would have confirmed her employment in a voice that was polite and entirely rehearsed. No one had called. The restaurant was perpetually short-staffed. The work was brutal, and Elena had presented herself as exactly what they needed. Quiet, reliable, invisible. She arrived early. She left late. She never called in sick. She never complained about being assigned the worst sections. She never lingered at the bar after her shift. She never flirted with the line cooks, or gossiped with the hostesses, or joined the rest of the staff for drinks on Sunday nights. She was, by every measure that mattered in the service industry, the perfect employee, which also meant she was the one no one noticed. She was 26 years old, though the shadows under her eyes and the way she carried her shoulders suggested someone who had been living longer than her years. Her hair was dark, pulled back in a tight bun that left her face exposed and unadorned. No earrings, no makeup beyond a thin line of concealer beneath each eye. Her uniform was always pressed, always buttoned to the collar, and she moved through the dining room with a quality that her co-workers mistook for shyness, but was something else entirely. It was economy. Every gesture was measured. Every step was deliberate. She carried plates the way a surgeon carries instruments, with a precision that suggested she understood the weight of what she held in her hands. Tonight she was assigned to the main floor, sections 3 and 4, 12 tables total, a manageable load on a Thursday evening, when half the city was still pretending it was too early in the week for a proper dinner. She had already completed 2 full rotations, delivering appetizers, refilling water glasses, reciting the specials with the same practiced cadence she used every night. Seared scallops with a cauliflower puree and brown butter, pappardelle with wild boar ragout, pan-roasted branzino with fennel and citrus. The words came out of her mouth with the mechanical smoothness of a recording, her voice low and even, never rising above the ambient hum of conversation and clinking glass. She smiled when required. She nodded when appropriate. She retreated the moment the interaction was complete, folding back into the shadows of the service corridor like water receding from a shore. But tonight, every time she passed the heavy oak door that sealed off the back dining room, she slowed. Not obviously. Not enough for anyone watching to notice. Just a fractional reduction in her pace, a slight turn of her head, a momentary shift in her breathing pattern. The door was closed, as it always was on Thursday nights. 2 men stood on either side of it, positioned with the relaxed alertness of professionals who had been standing outside doors for a very long time. They wore dark suits that fit too well to be off the rack, and expressions that fit too poorly to be genuine. One of them, the taller one with the shaved head and a scar that ran from his left ear to the corner of his jaw, had a habit of checking his watch every 90 seconds. The other, younger, with the build of a middleweight boxer gone slightly soft, kept his right hand in his jacket pocket in a way that was not casual. Elena knew what was behind that door. Everyone who worked at Ristorante Ferro knew, in the way that people know things they have agreed never to discuss. The back dining room was the domain of Dominic Ferro, not the restaurant's namesake. Not exactly, though the distinction between the man and the establishment had blurred over the years into something that resembled ownership without ever appearing on a deed or a liquor license. Dominic Ferro was the reason the restaurant existed. He was the reason the building had been renovated instead of demolished. The reason the chef had been recruited from a Michelin-starred kitchen in Milan. The reason the wine cellar contained bottles that could not be found on any public auction list. He was also the reason the staff turnover rate was remarkably low. The reason the health inspector never found violations. And the reason the neighborhood around the restaurant had, over the past decade, transformed from a derelict stretch of abandoned warehouses into one of the most desirable addresses in the city. Dominic Ferro did not own the restaurant. He owned the ecosystem. She had seen him only twice in her 11 months. The first time, he had been crossing the main dining room on his way to the back, and the room had responded to his presence the way a field of grass responds to a sudden wind. A ripple of awareness that moved through the seated diners without any of them understanding what had caused it. He was not tall, not in the way that demanded immediate attention. Perhaps 6 feet, perhaps an inch less, with the compact, centered build of a man who had been physical in his youth and had since traded muscle for something harder and less visible. His hair was dark, threaded with silver at the temples, cut close, and his face was a study in controlled geometry. Strong jaw, straight nose, a mouth that seemed incapable of anything as frivolous as a smile. But it was his eyes that had stopped Elena in mid-stride, caused her to grip the edge of her serving tray until her knuckles whitened. Dark, nearly black, and absolutely terrifyingly still. They were the eyes of a man who had spent decades making calculations that other men could not afford to get wrong. She had seen eyes like that before. Once, in a different life. The second time, 3 weeks ago, she had been restocking the linen closet adjacent to the back dining room when the door had opened unexpectedly, and for a span of perhaps 4 seconds, she had seen inside. A long table, dark wood, set with the same crystal and linen as the main room, but without the candles. Overhead, fluorescent panels instead, the light clinical and unforgiving, turning the space into something that resembled a boardroom more than a dining room. 6 men seated, jackets off, sleeves rolled to varying degrees, plates of food in front of them untouched or half-eaten. Maps spread across one end of the table. A laptop open, its screen casting a blue glow onto the face of the man seated before it. And at the head of the table, Dominic Ferro, leaning back in his chair with the absolute stillness of a man who does not need to lean forward to command attention. His eyes had found hers in that 4-second window. Found them and held them with a force that was not threatening, but was something worse. It was assessment. He had looked at her the way a jeweler looks at an uncut stone, determining value, determining authenticity, determining whether what he was seeing was worth the effort of a closer examination. The door had closed. She had finished restocking the linen. She had gone back to her tables. She had not mentioned it to anyone. She had gone home that night, to her 1-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on Hadley Street, and sat on the edge of her bed in the dark for 2 hours, breathing slowly, pressing her thumbs into the center of her palms, the way her father had taught her when the world became too much, and the body needed an anchor. Her father, Dr. Mikhail Vasile. The name surfaced in her mind like a stone rising from dark water, and she pushed it back down with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been pushing that stone down for 3 years. Not now, not here, not with 12 tables to manage, and a Thursday night crowd that was beginning to thicken and the smell of something wrong drifting from behind the oak door of the back dining room, like smoke from a fire that had not yet been discovered. She delivered a bottle of Barolo to table 7. She cleared the appetizer plates from table 12. She smiled at the couple celebrating an anniversary at table 9 and told them the tiramisu was exceptional tonight. Her voice warm and steady, her hands perfectly still, while inside her chest something was tightening like a wire being wound around a spool. Because she had smelled it. Faint, almost imperceptible beneath the layers of garlic and rosemary and slow braised veal. A sweetness that did not belong. An almond-like whisper that had no business being in a kitchen that did not use almond extract in any dish on tonight's menu. She had learned to identify that smell before she had learned to ride a bicycle. Her father had made sure of that. Dr. Mikhail Vasily had been a forensic toxicologist for 23 years, not the kind who appeared on television or published popular books about famous poisonings, but the kind who spent his days in a basement laboratory at the state medical examiner's office, hunched over gas chromatography readouts and tissue samples, cataloging the chemical fingerprints of death with the same quiet devotion that a monk might bring to transcribing scripture. He had been, by the accounts of everyone who knew him, a gentleman. A man who kept a vegetable garden and listened to Chopin and wore the same corduroy jacket every day for 11 years, until Elena's mother, before she left, had thrown it away and replaced it with something from a department store that he never quite forgave her for. He was a man who believed that the truth lived in molecules, in the invisible architecture of chemical compounds, and that his job was not to judge or punish, but simply to read what the dead had left behind in their blood and tissue and bone. He had also been a man who understood, with the clinical clarity of someone who spent his career studying the mechanisms of death, that the world was full of people who used chemistry as a weapon. And so he had taught his daughter. Not formally, not with textbooks and examinations, but in the way that a fisherman teaches his child to read the water. Over dinner conversations, over weekend visits to his lab when she was old enough to understand what the machines did, over bedtime explanations of why certain plants were beautiful but should never be touched, why certain smells meant safety and others meant danger, why the human nose, properly trained, could detect compounds at concentrations measured in parts per billion. He had taught her about oleander and ricin and the quiet lethality of heavy metals administered in doses too small to taste. He had taught her about the bitter almond scent of hydrogen cyanide and its derivatives, about how it was not the dramatic, instantly lethal poison of spy novels, but something more insidious, more patient, a compound that could be masked in food with sufficient skill, that attacked the body's ability to use oxygen at the cellular level, that could kill in minutes at sufficient doses or over hours at lower ones, and that the critical window for intervention was narrow and unforgiving. He had taught her these things not to frighten her, but because he believed, with the conviction of a man who had seen too many bodies on steel tables, that knowledge was the only reliable form of protection. 3 years ago, Dr. Mikhail Vasily had been found dead in his laboratory. The official cause of death was cardiac arrest. The unofficial cause, the one that Elena had spent 14 months and every dollar of her savings trying to prove, was that he had been silenced. He had been preparing expert testimony for a federal case involving the contamination of a municipal water supply by a chemical manufacturing company whose owners had connections that reached into places where connections are not supposed to reach. His testimony would have been devastating. His data was meticulous. His conclusions were unassailable. And then his heart had stopped, quietly in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, and the case had collapsed, and the manufacturing company had settled out of court for an amount that was large enough to make headlines, but small enough to ensure that no one went to prison. Elena had not been able to prove anything. The autopsy had been performed by a colleague of her father's, who had found nothing irregular. The toxicology screen, irony of ironies, had come back clean. She had petitioned for a second autopsy. Denied. She had filed a complaint with the state medical board. Investigated and dismissed. She had contacted 3 investigative journalists, 2 of whom never responded, and one of whom published a short article that was read by 4,000 people and changed nothing. She had been thorough. She had been persistent. She had been completely, utterly powerless. And so she had disappeared. Not dramatically, not in the way of spy novels and thriller films, but in the quiet, grinding way that ordinary people disappear when the systems that are supposed to protect them reveal themselves to be indifferent. She had sold her father's house. She had closed her bank accounts and opened new ones under her mother's maiden name. She had moved 400 miles south, to a city where no one knew her, and she had taken a job carrying plates for people who would never look at her face long enough to remember it. She had become invisible. It was the only form of safety she had left. But she had not stopped smelling. She had not stopped noticing. And tonight, in the amber-lit cathedral of Ristorante Ferro, with 12 tables demanding her attention, and the Thursday night crowd swelling toward its peak, she could smell something that made every lesson her father had ever taught her ignite like a fuse burning toward a charge. The kitchen was a storm of controlled chaos. Chef Luciano Marchetti, a Milanese transplant with forearms like bridge cables, and a vocabulary of profanity that spanned 4 languages, commanded his domain from the pass, the stainless steel counter where finished dishes were inspected, garnished, and released to the floor staff. His voice cut through the clash of pans and the hiss of searing protein with the precision of a conductor's baton. Behind him, the line cooks moved in a choreography born of repetition and fear, each one occupying their station with the focused intensity of soldiers manning a fortification. The grill station radiated a heat that could be felt from 10 feet away. The sauté station was a percussion section of clanging metal and roaring flame. The pastry station, tucked in the far corner, was a pocket of relative calm, where a young woman with flour-dusted hands assembled desserts with the patience of a watchmaker. Elena entered the kitchen through the swinging doors and moved toward the pass to collect the entrees for table 11. But her path took her past the prep station for the back dining room, a separate counter on the far side of the kitchen, partially screened by a tall shelving unit stacked with hotel pans and dry goods. This station operated on its own timeline, its own menu, its own set of rules. The dishes prepared here were not from Chef Marchetti's regular menu. They were prepared by Marco, the sous chef, a thick-necked man in his 40s with small, careful hands, and a face that revealed nothing. Marco had been at Ristorante Ferro longer than anyone except the dishwashers, and he occupied a position in the kitchen hierarchy that was defined less by his title than by the fact that no one, not even Chef Marchetti, ever questioned what he prepared for the back room or how he prepared it. Tonight, Marco was plating the main course for the back dining room. Osso buco, veal shanks braised in white wine and aromatics, the meat falling from the bone in soft, dark folds, the gremolata, a bright green crown of parsley, garlic, and lemon zest scattered across the top. It was one of the chef's signature preparations, a dish that had been written about in food magazines, and that regulars ordered weeks in advance. 8 plates arranged in 2 rows on the stainless counter, each one identical, each one glistening under the harsh fluorescent light of the prep area. Elena glanced at the plates as she passed. A reflex, a habit that 11 months of carrying food had turned into something automatic. She glanced and she kept walking, and then she stopped. It was the gremolata. On 7 of the 8 plates, the gremolata was the same. Bright green, finely chopped, with the clean, sharp scent of fresh parsley and raw garlic and lemon zest that cut through the richness of the braised veal like a knife through silk. But on the 8th plate, the plate positioned at the front left of the arrangement, the plate that would be served first, the plate that was always served to the head of the table, the gremolata was different. The color was fractionally darker. The texture was fractionally finer, and the smell that rose from it in a thin, invisible column that only a nose trained by 23 years of forensic toxicology lessons could detect, carried a note that was sweet where it should have been sharp, round where it should have been angular, and unmistakably, undeniably, wrong. Elena's feet stopped moving. Her hands, which had been reaching for the plates at the pass for table 11, dropped to her sides. Her breathing changed, shallow and rapid, the way a person breathes when the body recognizes danger before the mind has finished processing the data. She stared at the 8th plate. She stared at the gremolata. She stared at the way the overhead light caught the surface of the garnish and revealed, to eyes that knew what to look for, a faint, almost imperceptible sheen that fresh parsley does not produce. An oiliness, a residue. The calling card of a compound that had been dissolved, reduced and folded into the herbs with the kind of precision that required not just knowledge, but intent. Marco was not at the station. He had stepped away, perhaps to the walk-in, perhaps to the restroom, perhaps to do whatever it was that Marco did during the gaps in his carefully managed timeline. The plates sat unattended. The clock on the kitchen wall read 9:12. The back dining room had been seated since 8:45. Appetizers had been served and cleared. The main course was due in the next 5 to 7 minutes. The plates would be collected by the 2 servers assigned to the back room, neither of whom Elena knew well, both of whom had been hired specifically for Thursday evenings, and who moved through the kitchen with the practiced silence of men who understood that their job required them to see nothing and remember less. 5 to 7 minutes. Elena stood in the kitchen of Ristorante Ferro, surrounded by the roar and crash of a service in full swing, and felt the world narrow to a single point. The 8th plate, the sheen on the gremolata, the sweet, wrong smell that she could feel in her sinuses like a needle. And behind the oak door at the end of the corridor, a man with dark eyes and silver-threaded hair who was about to eat it. She thought of her father. Not the memory she usually fought against, not the laboratory, not the Tuesday afternoon, not the phone call that had gutted her life like a fish. A different memory. Earlier. Warmer. A summer evening on the back porch of the house on Birchwood Lane, the vegetable garden throwing long green shadows across the lawn, the smell of tomato plants and warm earth and the Chopin nocturne drifting from the open kitchen window. She was 14. He was sitting beside her, still wearing the corduroy jacket that her mother had not yet thrown away, a glass of iced tea sweating in his hand, and he was telling her about a case. A woman who had been poisoned by her husband over the course of 8 months. Arsenic in her morning tea, microscopic doses, patient, methodical. The woman had gone to 3 doctors, none of whom had tested for heavy metals, because the symptoms mimicked autoimmune disease. By the time she arrived on Dr. Vasile's table, the arsenic had been woven into her hair and nails like thread into fabric, a chemical diary of 8 months of slow murder. Elena had asked him why. Not why the husband had done it. She was 14, and she understood that people were capable of terrible things. She had asked why no one had caught it sooner. Why the doctors, the nurses, the friends, the family, all the people who were supposed to notice, had failed. Her father had set down his iced tea. He had looked at her with those quiet gray eyes that saw everything and judged nothing. And he had said, in the tone he reserved for the lessons that mattered most, that most people do not smell the poison because most people do not believe the poison is there. They trust the plate. They trust the hand that serves it. They trust the kitchen, the system, the assumption that the world operates on a baseline of good faith. And most of the time, they are right. But the times they are wrong, the times the poison is real and the hand is steady and the intent is lethal, those are the times when the people who can smell it have a responsibility that supersedes every other consideration. Comfort, safety, protocol, career. The ability to smell the poison, he had told her, holding her gaze with an intensity she would not fully understand for another decade, is not a gift. It is an obligation. She was standing in a kitchen. She was a waitress. She was invisible. She had built her invisibility with the same care and precision that a mason builds a wall, brick by careful brick, and the wall had kept her alive for 3 years. If she moved, if she spoke, if she did anything other than collect the plates for table 11 and return to her section, the wall would crack, and behind the wall was everything she had spent 3 years burying. Her name, her history, her father's legacy, the federal case that had collapsed, the people who had made it collapse, the machinery of power that had ground her father's life's work into dust and moved on without a backward glance. The clock read 9:13. Marco would return any moment. The backroom servers would appear to collect the plates. The 8th plate, with its sheen and its sweetness, and its wrong smell, would be carried through the oak door and set before a man whose stillness was not peace, but preparation, and who would eat it because he trusted the hand that served it. He trusted the kitchen. He trusted the system. Elena's hands began to tremble. She pressed her thumbs into the centers of her palms. She breathed. She made her decision. She did not take the plates for table 11. She did not return to her section. She turned and walked out of the kitchen through the swinging doors and into the main dining room with a stride that was no longer the measured, invisible glide of a waitress, but something faster, harder, more direct. Her shoes struck the polished concrete floor with a sharpness that drew glances from the nearest tables. Her face, usually a mask of pleasant blankness, had gone tight, the muscles along her jaw clenching with a force that redefined the geometry of her features. She was no longer Elena, the waitress. She was something else. Something that had been sleeping for 3 years and had just been woken by the smell of bitter almonds. The back dining room was 42 feet from the kitchen entrance. She covered the distance in seconds that felt like hours, each step a separate, distinct act of will, each step carrying her further from the safety of her invisible life and closer to something that could not be taken back. The 2 men flanking the oak door saw her coming. The tall one with the scar straightened from his lean against the wall. The younger one withdrew his hand from his jacket pocket. They did not reach for weapons. They did not shout warnings. They simply shifted their weight forward, onto the balls of their feet, with the fluid readiness of men whose bodies were trained to intercept before their minds finished deciding whether interception was necessary. She did not slow down. She did not stop. She reached the door at full stride, and the tall one put his hand up, palm out, a gesture that was polite in form and absolute in function, and she looked at him with an expression that made his hand falter for a fraction of a second, not from fear but from confusion, because waitresses do not look at men like him with that expression. That expression belonged to a different category of person entirely. She pushed past his hand. She seized the door handle. She pulled the door open. And the sound that came out of her mouth was not the quiet, measured voice of a waitress reciting specials. It was a sound that began in her diaphragm and tore through the dining room like a siren. A single, shattering syllable that silenced every conversation, every clink of crystal, every murmured negotiation in the amber-lit cathedral of Ristorante Ferro. Do not eat that. The back dining room was exactly as she had glimpsed it 3 weeks ago. The long, dark table, the fluorescent light, the maps, the laptop. 7 men in various states of shirt-sleeve informality, their meals before them, their conversations interrupted mid-sentence, their faces turning toward the open door with expressions that cycled through surprise, irritation, and a hard, calculating alertness in the space of a single heartbeat. And at the head of the table, Dominic Ferro, who had lifted his fork, who had gathered a portion of ossobuco and gremolata onto the tines, who had brought the fork to within 6 inches of his mouth, and who had stopped. His eyes found hers, the same eyes, dark, nearly black, absolutely still. But something moved behind that stillness now, a flicker of something that was not anger and not amusement, and not the cold assessment she had seen 3 weeks ago. It was attention. The total, undivided, almost predatory attention of a man who had survived decades in a world that killed the inattentive. The fork remained suspended. The room remained silent. 7 men stared at the woman in the doorway. The 2 guards appeared behind her, flanking her, their hands hovering at their sides, in postures of restrained readiness. And Elena stood in the threshold, between the world she had built and the world she was about to enter, and she said it again, quieter this time, but with a clarity that filled every corner of the fluorescent-lit room. Do not eat that food. The silence that followed was architectural. It had weight and dimension and load-bearing capacity. It pressed against the walls. It compressed the air. It turned the fluorescent light into something harsh and interrogative. A spotlight on a stage where the script had just been torn in half. Dominic Farrow set his fork down. The motion was slow, deliberate, controlled. The fork placed on the edge of the plate with the precision of a chess piece being repositioned on a board. He did not look away from Elena. He did not blink. He leaned back in his chair, the same posture she had seen 3 weeks ago, the posture of a man who does not need to lean forward, and he waited. One of the men at the table, seated to Farrow's immediate right, was the first to speak. Sal Torrente, a broad man with a face that looked like it had been carved from sandstone and reassembled by someone who had lost the instructions. His voice was a low growl that carried the weight of authority delegated but not fully earned. "Get her out. Now!" The guards moved forward. One of them gripped Elena's arm above the elbow, firmly, professionally, without malice, but without gentleness. She did not resist. She did not flinch. She kept her eyes on Dominic Farrow and spoke with the same clinical precision that her father had used when presenting findings to a courtroom. "The gremolata on your plate is different from the gremolata on every other plate at this table. It contains a compound that should not be there. I can smell it. It is not a seasoning. It is not an herb. It is a toxin. If you eat that food, you will begin to experience symptoms within 15 to 20 minutes. Headache, dizziness, difficulty breathing, rapid heart rate. And depending on the concentration, which I cannot determine by smell alone, you may not survive the next 2 hours." The room did not breathe. 7 men, each of whom had spent years navigating a world where information was currency and trust was a luxury, processed the words with the speed of machines running threat calculations. Eyes moved, not to Elena, to each other. A lateral scan, rapid and involuntary, the instinctive evaluation of a group that has just been told there is a predator among them. Farrow had not moved. His eyes had not left Elena's face. His hands rested on the arms of his chair, fingers relaxed, a posture that communicated absolute control over every muscle in his body, and, by extension, over the room itself. When he spoke, his voice was low, unhurried, and stripped of everything except the question. "How do you know?" Not an accusation, not a challenge. A question asked by a man who had built an empire on the ability to distinguish between those who told the truth and those who performed it. Elena's arm was still in the guard's grip. She could feel the pressure of his fingers through the fabric of her uniform, could feel the adrenaline moving through her bloodstream in a cold, electric current that made her fingertips tingle and her vision sharpen to a clarity that was almost painful. She answered him the way her father would have answered, with facts, without decoration. My father was a forensic toxicologist. He spent 23 years identifying poisons in human tissue. He trained me from childhood to recognize the olfactory signatures of common and uncommon toxic compounds. The gremolata on your plate carries a faint but distinct scent of bitter almond. Not almond extract. Not amaretto. The signature is consistent with a cyanide derivative, most likely potassium cyanide dissolved and reduced into an oil-based solution, then folded into the herb mixture. The preparation is skilled. The concentration is sufficient to be masked by the garlic and lemon in the gremolata, but it is there, and I smelled it. The silence returned. Heavier this time. Farrow's gaze held hers for a count of 5, 6, 7. Then, without looking away from her, he spoke a single word. "Victor." A man at the far end of the table stood. Lean, angular, dressed in a dark shirt with the sleeves rolled to the forearms, revealing tattoos that were not decorative, but institutional. Victor moved with the efficiency of a man who had been waiting for this instruction. He walked to Farrow's plate, lifted it from the table, and carried it to a side counter where he produced, from a briefcase that had been sitting unopened beneath his chair, a small leather case. He unzipped it. Inside, arranged in foam-lined slots, were glass vials, reagent strips, and a device that looked like a thick pen with a digital readout on its side. A a field testing kit. The kind used by law enforcement for drug identification, adapted for broader chemical screening. Victor worked in silence. He scraped a sample of the gremolata into a vial. He added a reagent. He waited. The room watched. Elena watched. Pharaoh watched. The digital readout on the pen-like device blinked once, twice, and then held steady on a number that meant nothing to Elena, but that made Victor's hands go still. He looked up. He looked at Pharaoh, and the expression on his face was the expression of a man who has just been told that the foundation of the building he is standing in has been compromised. She is right. 2 words, spoken quietly, and the room detonated. Not with noise, not with shouting. The detonation was internal, structural, a seismic shift that rearranged the architecture of every relationship and every assumption in that room in the span of a single breath. Eyes that had been scanning laterally now locked onto specific targets. Bodies that had been still now coiled with the kinetic potential of violence, held in check by the thinnest membrane of discipline. The air, which had been compressed by silence, now hummed with a frequency that Elena could feel in her teeth. Pharaoh did not detonate. Pharaoh did not coil. Pharaoh remained exactly as he was, leaned back, hands on the armrests, eyes dark and still and processing information at a speed that the men around him could not match. He did not look at the plate. He did not look at Victor. He looked at each man seated at the table, one by one, with the slow, deliberate attention of a man reading the final chapter of a book he already knows the ending to. He began with Sal Torrente, the broad man to his right, whose face had not changed, whose sandstone features remained fixed in an expression of controlled neutrality that was, in itself, the most damning piece of evidence in the room. A man who had just been told that his boss's food was poisoned should show shock, fear, outrage. Sal Torrente showed none of these things. He showed the careful blankness of a man who had known, who had expected, who had been waiting for the fork to reach the mouth and the chemistry to do its work. Pharaoh saw it. He saw it the way a predator sees the slight variation in movement that distinguishes the injured prey from the healthy ones. He saw it, and his expression did not change, and that absence of change was more terrifying than any eruption of rage could have been. Because rage was temporary. Rage was emotional. What moved across Dominic Pharaoh's face in that moment was something geological, something that operated on a timescale measured not in seconds, but in consequences. Sal. Pharaoh's voice was a murmur, the gentlest sound in the room. How long? Torrente did not answer. His eyes, which had been fixed on a point somewhere above Pharaoh's left shoulder, shifted downward, and in that shift, in that involuntary descent of his gaze, was the confession that his words were refusing to deliver. The men on either side of Torrente moved, not toward him, away from him, a physical distancing that was instinctive and immediate, the way the body recoils from heat. Torrente was now isolated at the table, a man on an island that was shrinking by the second, and his thick hands, which had been resting flat on the tablecloth, began to tremble with a vibration so fine it was almost invisible. Pharaoh turned his attention to Elena. The shift was palpable. The weight of his gaze redirected, and she felt it like a change in atmospheric pressure, a sudden equalization that left her ears ringing. Let her go. The guard released her arm. She felt the blood rush back into the compressed tissue, a warm flooding that made her fingers flex involuntarily. She stood in the doorway, unrestrained, and the distance between her and the door to the main dining room was 6 steps, and the distance between her and the life she had built over 3 years was collapsing by the second, and she did not move. Pharaoh studied her, not the way he had studied Torrente, with the cold calculation of a man identifying a threat. This was different. This was the assessment she had glimpsed 3 weeks ago through the briefly opened door, the jeweler examining the uncut stone, but now the examination was thorough, unhurried, and conducted with a respect that was evident in its patience. Your father? He spoke the words as if testing their weight. A toxicologist. Yes. His name. Mikhail Vasile. Something moved behind Pharaoh's eyes. A recognition. Not of the name itself, perhaps, but of the category it belonged to. A man of science. A man of precision. A man who served the truth in a world that preferred convenient lies. Pharaoh understood that category. He inhabited a different version of it. And you are his daughter, working as a waitress, in my restaurant. It was not a question. It was a restatement of fact, delivered with a tone that suggested he was reassembling a puzzle whose pieces had just revealed a picture he had not expected. Elena met his gaze. She did not look away. She did not explain. She did not offer her story, her grief, her 3 years of invisible exile. She simply stood and let the facts speak for themselves, which was the most eloquent thing she could have done, because Dominic Pharaoh was a man who respected silence more than speech and who understood that the people who do not explain themselves are usually the ones who do not need to. He nodded, a single measured inclination of his head. Then he turned back to the table. The next 40 minutes unfolded with the mechanical precision of a process that had been designed for exactly this contingency. Pharaoh spoke quietly to Victor, who made 2 phone calls. The guards at the door were replaced by 4 different men who arrived through the service entrance within 12 minutes, men whose suits were cut differently and whose eyes carried a professional emptiness that the original guards had not. Sal Torrente was escorted from the room. He did not struggle. He did not speak. He walked between 2 of the new arrivals with the heavy, defeated stride of a man who has played his last card and watched it burn. His face, as he passed Elena in the doorway, was the color of old ash, and his eyes, which had been so carefully blank, were now wide and wet with the particular terror of a man who understands, with total clarity, the nature and magnitude of the mistake he has made. The remaining men at the table were questioned, not by Pharaoh, by Victor, who conducted the interviews with the quiet efficiency of a man who had done this before, and who understood that the most effective interrogation technique was not intimidation, but patience. One by one, each man was asked a series of questions about the evening's preparations, about the food, about the kitchen, about Marco. Their answers were recorded on Victor's phone. Their faces were recorded by Victor's eyes. Marco, the sous chef, was brought to the back dining room 17 minutes after Torrente's removal. He entered with the confused, blinking expression of a man who had been pulled from his station in the middle of service, and could not understand why. He saw the testing kit on the side counter. He saw the plate with the scraped gremolata. He saw Pharaoh, and the confusion on his face underwent a transformation that was as revealing as a signed confession. It did not become fear. It became resignation. The resigned expression of a man who has been caught, and who, on some level, has been expecting to be caught, and who understands that the energy required to maintain a lie has finally exceeded his capacity to generate it. Marco had been paid. The sum, which he disclosed under Victor's patient questioning, was $200,000. The arrangement had been made through an intermediary, a man Marco knew only as Luca, who had approached him 6 weeks ago with a proposition that was framed not as a murder, but as a business transaction. A shift in organizational structure. A change in management. The kind of language that allowed a man who braised veal with the tenderness of a poet to fold poison into his gremolata without confronting the reality of what he was doing. Elena stood in the corridor outside the back dining room during the questioning. She leaned against the raw brick wall, her back pressed against the cool, rough surface, her arms crossed over her chest, her breathing slow and controlled. The adrenaline was receding, leaving in its wake a trembling exhaustion that started in her knees and moved upward through her body like water rising in a vessel. She had done it. She had smelled the poison. She had spoken. She had cracked the wall she had spent 3 years building. And now she was standing in the rubble, and she did not know what came next. A server she did not recognize brought her a glass of water. She drank it. Another server, one of the Thursday night regulars, walked past without looking at her, his eyes fixed forward, his face a mask of deliberate ignorance. The kitchen continued to operate, Chef Marchetti's voice still cut through the clatter. The main dining room still hummed with conversation and crystal. The world outside the back dining room continued as if nothing had happened, which was, Elena understood, the entire point. In this world, the most significant events occurred in rooms that most people never entered, and the machinery of consequence operated in silence, behind oak doors, under fluorescent light. At 10:47, Victor emerged from the back dining room and approached her. He stood at a respectful distance, hands clasped in front of him, and studied her with an expression that was not hostile, but was not warm. It was professional. The expression of a man whose job it was to evaluate assets. He would like to speak with you. Elena pushed off the wall. She uncrossed her arms. She pressed her thumbs into the centers of her palms one final time. An anchor, a tether to the man who had taught her to smell the poison, and to understand the obligation that came with it. Then she walked through the oak door and back into the fluorescent light. The room had been cleared. The plates were gone. The maps were gone. The laptop was closed. The table had been stripped to bare wood, and the only things remaining on its surface were 2 glasses of water and, between them, a single white plate bearing a piece of bread that had been torn from a loaf, not cut. Pharaoh sat at the head of the table. The chair to his right, the chair Torrente had occupied, was empty and pushed back from the table at an angle that suggested its former occupant had not left willingly. Pharaoh gestured to a chair across from him. Not the empty chair. A different one, positioned at a conversational distance that was neither too close nor too far. The distance of equals. Elena sat. The chair was heavy and cold. She placed her hands on the table, palms down, and waited. Pharaoh looked at her hands, at the way they rested on the wood, steady, controlled, no tremor, no fidgeting, no nervous energy. He looked at her face, at the shadows under her eyes, and the tight set of her jaw, and the way her gaze met his without challenge, but without submission. He looked at her the way he had looked at the men who had been questioned, but with a critical difference. He was not searching for deception. He was measuring capacity. You could have said nothing. His voice was quiet, not soft. There is a difference between quiet and soft, and Pharaoh's voice occupied the precise boundary between the two. Quiet is a choice. Soft is a condition. He had chosen. Elena did not respond. There was nothing to say to a statement that was true. You could have walked past the kitchen, collected your tables, finished your shift and gone home. No one would have known. No one would have blamed you. He paused. The pause was not hesitation. It was punctuation. And I would be dead. The words sat between them on the bare wood table like a stone placed with deliberate precision. Instead, you broke through 2 of my men, opened a door that no one in this restaurant has ever opened uninvited, and screamed at me in front of my organization. He studied her. The shadow of something that might, in a different man, have been amusement moved across his features. It was gone before it could be confirmed. No one has screamed at me in 17 years. Elena's throat was dry. She took the glass of water nearest to her and drank. The water was cold and clean and tasted like nothing, which was exactly what she needed. I did not scream at you. I screamed for you. The distinction landed. She saw it register in the fractional adjustment of his posture, a shift so subtle that most people would not have noticed it. But Elena had spent 11 months studying the body language of the people around her with the same clinical attention her father had applied to tissue samples. The shift was forward. Not a lean, not a lunge, but a reorientation of his center of gravity toward her that changed the nature of the conversation from interrogation to engagement. Pharaoh tore a piece from the bread on the plate. He ate it. The gesture was simple, almost casual, but Elena understood its significance. He was eating, in her presence, after his food had been poisoned. He was telling her something without words, and what he was telling her was that he trusted the bread because she had not told him not to eat it. Your father. He died 3 years ago. She went still. Not the stillness of the prey that freezes when the shadow of the hawk crosses the ground. The stillness of a person who has just heard a door open that they thought was locked. I know the name Vasile. Pharaoh's voice carried no inflection, no emotional weight. He was presenting data. Your father's laboratory processed evidence for federal cases that occasionally intersected with interests relevant to mine. Not my interests. The interests of people I was required to monitor. He paused again. The halcyon chemical case. Elena's heart rate spiked. She felt it in her wrists, in her temples, in the sudden pressure behind her eyes that preceded tears she had not shed in 3 years, and would not shed now. Halcyon Chemical. The company that had contaminated the water supply, the company whose owners had connections, the company whose quiet influence had reached into a laboratory on a Tuesday afternoon and stopped a man's heart. She said nothing. She did not need to. Pharaoh could read the answer in the architecture of her silence. I was not involved in your father's death. The words were precise, clinical, offered with the directness of a man who understood that ambiguity was a luxury he could not afford in this moment. But I am aware of the parties who were. I have been aware for some time. Their operations have, on occasion, created complications for my own. He reached into the interior pocket of his jacket and produced a card. Not a business card. A plain white card, with a phone number written on it in black ink, the handwriting small and precise and slanted slightly to the left. He placed it on the table between them. You saved my life tonight. That is a debt that I take seriously. But I am not offering you payment. I am not offering you charity. I am offering you something else. He pushed the card toward her with one finger. You have a skill set that is extraordinary, and that is being wasted in a dining room. You have knowledge of chemical forensics that my current organization lacks. You have instincts that cannot be taught. And you have a reason to want access to certain information that I have the ability to provide. Elena looked at the card. The number was handwritten. 10 digits. No name, no address. No context beyond the implication carried by the hand that had placed it there. I am not asking you to work for me. Pharaoh's voice dropped to its lowest register, a frequency that she felt in her sternum rather than heard with her ears. I am asking you to work with me. There is a difference. And you, more than most, understand the importance of that distinction. She looked at him. The fluorescent light was unforgiving, stripping away the shadows and the amber warmth of the main dining room, and revealing every line, every scar, every evidence of the years and the decisions that had carved his face into its current form. He was not a good man. She knew this. He operated in a world of shadows, and the things he controlled and the methods he employed were not the things and methods of a man who could stand in sunlight without casting a shadow that swallowed everything around it. But he was looking at her with an expression that she recognized, because she had seen it once before, on a summer evening on a back porch in the fading light, on the face of a man in a corduroy jacket who was telling her about the obligation that came with being able to smell the poison. He was looking at her as if she mattered, not because she had saved him, though she had. Not because she possessed skills he needed, though she did. He was looking at her as if the fact of her existence, the fact that a woman with her father's nose, and her father's integrity, and her father's quiet, unbreakable courage, had walked into his restaurant, and refused to be invisible when invisibility would have been so much easier, had altered something in his understanding of what was possible. Elena picked up the card. The paper was heavy, textured, the kind of cardstock that cost more per sheet than she earned in an hour. She held it between her fingers and felt the weight of it, not the physical weight, which was negligible, but the other weight, the weight of a door opening onto a corridor she could not see the end of. She put the card in the breast pocket of her uniform. Then she stood, pushed her chair back to the table with the same precision she used when resetting a table after a guest departed, and walked out of the back dining room for the last time as a waitress. 6 months is a geological age in the life of a woman who has spent 3 years standing still. The apartment above the dry cleaner on Hadley Street was vacated within a week. The uniform was returned, pressed and folded, in a paper bag left on the hostess stand before the breakfast shift on a Monday morning. The name Elena Vasile appeared on no employment records, no lease agreements, no utility bills. She disappeared from the world she had built with the same quiet efficiency with which she had appeared in it, and in the wake of her disappearance, the staff of Ristorante Ferro barely noticed. A new waitress was hired. The sections were reassigned. Thursday evenings continued, but in a different part of the city, in a building whose address was known to fewer than 20 people. A woman who had once carried plates now carried files. Toxicology reports, chemical analysis summaries, environmental contamination data, evidence of poisoning not at a dining table, but at an industrial scale, the systematic contamination of water and soil and air by companies whose owners had the connections and the resources to silence the men who documented their crimes. Dr. Mikhail Vasile's daughter had access now. Access to databases, access to informants, access to the kind of information that her father had died trying to bring to light, provided by a man whose power operated in the shadows, but whose debt was paid in daylight. She worked with a team that Victor assembled. 3 forensic analysts, a former EPA investigator, a data specialist whose ability to trace financial transactions through layers of shell corporations bordered on the supernatural. They occupied a floor of the building that had been converted into a laboratory and office space, and Elena moved through it with the same economy of motion she had once brought to the dining room, but with a different quality animating her movements. Purpose. The specific, concentrated purpose of a woman who has found the intersection between what she can do and what needs to be done. The Halcyon chemical case was reopened. Not by a federal prosecutor, not by a state medical examiner, not by any of the institutional mechanisms that had failed the first time. It was reopened by the quiet, relentless accumulation of evidence gathered by a woman who could smell the poison, and a network of people who could trace it back to the hand that had administered it. The evidence was compiled, documented, and delivered anonymously to a journalist who had earned a reputation for incorruptibility and who published a series of articles that could not be ignored, dismissed, or settled out of court. On a Tuesday afternoon, exactly 3 years and 4 months after Dr. Mikhail Vasile's heart had stopped in his laboratory, Elena sat in a conference room and watched a live news broadcast on a wall-mounted screen. Federal agents entering the offices of Halcyon Chemical, executives in handcuffs. A press conference where a United States attorney stood behind a podium bristling with microphones and announced a 16-count indictment that included conspiracy, racketeering, environmental fraud, and, at the end of the list, delivered in a voice that was steady and unremarkable, and that nonetheless made Elena's hands shake for the first and last time in 4 months, accessory to murder. She was alone in the conference room. She had asked to be alone. The screen cast a blue glow across her face, the same blue glow she had seen reflected on the face of the man at the laptop when the door had opened 3 weeks into her employment at Ristorante Ferro, and she sat very still and breathed very slowly and watched the men who had killed her father walk into the daylight in handcuffs. She did not cry. She did not smile. She pressed her thumbs into the centers of her palms, and she felt the weight of the moment settle into her bones, the way sediment settles into the bed of a river, slowly, permanently, becoming part of the structure. That evening, she returned to the building where she worked and found on her desk a single glass of red wine and a card. Not the plain white card with the phone number. A different card. Heavy stock. Black ink. 2 words in the same precise, left-slanting hand. Well done. She picked up the glass. She smelled it. Sangiovese, black cherry, dried herbs, earth. No bitterness. No sweetness where sweetness did not belong. No sheen. Nothing wrong. Nothing hidden. Just wine, honest and uncomplicated, offered by a man who understood that the most powerful gesture of trust is the simplest one. She drank. The glass was empty when she set it down, and the conference room was quiet, and the blue glow of the screen had been replaced by the warm amber light of the desk lamp, and outside the window the city moved and breathed and hummed with the oblivious energy of a world that did not know what had happened in this room, in this building, in the space between a waitress and a man whose food she had refused to let him eat. Some debts are paid in money, some are paid in favors, and some are paid in the only currency that cannot be counterfeited, the recognition that the quietest person in the room may be the one whose voice, when it finally rises, changes everything.